did get a budget agreement this week. Do you see there being winners and losers here in this, or is there something more to it than that?
It's probably a little more complex than that, yeah. It's a good way to put it. Certainly you have to say, although they're not acting like it, you have to say that education overall still remains comparatively protected. What finally happened is that the cuts within the various elements of education, career tech, higher ed, and of course common ed, which is the largest of all, finally somewhat exceed the overall budget cut level. Here's what I mean. Overall reduction is 3.2%, but for example, common ed is going to take a 4.1% reduction. Higher ed is going to take a 5.8% reduction. Career tech was even higher than that. Seems to me it was 7% or something. Now, when you translate all that, well, why does that mean they were comparatively protected? Well, that is where the money is. That's where the money is in Oklahoma state government. Those three added together take in more than half of the expenditures every year. It was very interesting. There was some division in the reaction because Glenn Johnson said, hey, this is the result of hard work and we respect the process and we support it. David Boren took a very critical posture of saying that they should have given up the 1/4% income tax reduction, or reversed that or delayed it in order to fund more government services. So I'm getting down in education because it's the lion's shares of the budget, and that's why that's very significant that this year they did have to go beyond what they've been doing, which is to keep them below the cuts across the board. Some agencies' cuts from 5 to 9% are not uncommon. Winners, I guess you could say that agriculture, which has really had a rough ride in terms of state appropriations over the last few years, took only, I think it was a 2.9% reduction this year. The Attorney General's office is gaining a lot of responsibility, and on the surface, looks like they're getting more money, but they are not gaining as much new money as they are gaining new responsibilities in various areas. So, Corporation Commission, really some technical changes that make it look like they have more money, but actually some trade out on the underground storage units, which we've all covered before. It's finally being recognized that's not going to happen, so it's being restored to the budget. Supreme Court is getting a budget increase, but they're moving across the street to the old History Center and are going to have to start paying their own utilities instead of just being part of the Capitol DCS. So on and on from there. Transportation, pretty hefty budget cut, but a major bond issue, especially for a tough year, $70 million if that goes through. The various elected officials took their medicine, high single-digit budget cuts, governor's office, auditor and inspector, several of the others, treasurer. A little bit less for the lieutenant governor, but the lieutenant governor is a very small office and has taken larger cuts in the past. So racing through that, now the critics are saying this is going to result in higher class sizes. It's going to lead to paying for seniors. There's a lot of other implications to it, and certainly there are line items. I guess leavening that, it's this interesting news about Oklahomans being so incredibly generous, the most generous state in the nation on a per capita basis. Kind of an amazing statistic, but one that seems to match what we think about ourselves and what we think about our neighbors and our friends. Frankly, there's probably going to be a need for the private sector to step up even more, and people in the private sector have been generous in Oklahoma, but if they want to maintain some of these functions, they may be shifting. We're going to see. The one argument that I don't really hear being engaged in by the Fallin administration too much is that discussion about right-sizing. Is this a right-sizing budget, or is it a tinkering budget? I don't have a ready answer for that. I fall a little closer initially to the tinkering because they basically got a balanced budget on time, which is what they have to do every year, but it's not a fundamental elimination of any major government functions.
I agree with you there that this was a tinkering, not a right-sizing. Although she ran on that platform and says that's eventually something that she's going to do.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
All right, let's talk about the pension system, and governor has signed some bills into law. Are these things that are going to have a significant impact on the health of the system?
Yeah, you know, it's easy to get into hyperbole in politics and in public policy and even in journalism. It's hard to disagree with Randy McDaniel in this case. He said this might be the signature achievement of the 2011 legislature, and he's probably right. Think about it. Every year we get a budget, one way or another, because it's required by the Constitution. A lot of screaming, yelling, difficulty, hard choices. We get a budget every year. It's obvious on its face that we don't get pension reform every year. There's been some decent proposals in the last decade, some of which passed, some of which didn't, that improved the underlying structure of the pension system, but nothing comprehensive. This is significant. Removing the COLAs alone closed about $5.4 billion out of a $16 billion gap. But the other things they did another $1.8 billion, looking at it actuarially and projecting it over a 20, 30-year period. They made up for about 40% of the unfunded liabilities. The one reason that's significant is that the state will probably avoid what looked inevitable just weeks ago, and that was a reduction in our bond rating, which is good. Our bond rating is strong, but now that the agencies are looking at pension debt and looking at it very seriously, it was going to have an effect, and they should look at it. It was going to have an effect on our rating. That probably won't happen now. So we got 40% of the gap closed. A lot of particulars, raising the retirement age for some public employees, no COLAs, no cost of living adjustments, unless the money's in the pipeline and that you have identified the way to do it. I'll give you one thumbnail. The worst of the state retirement systems in terms of adequacy of funding, 48%, the teacher retirement system. That one change takes it to 56, 57%. It's dramatic. There's nothing that the government of Oklahoma has done in the last 30, 40 years as dramatic on the positive side on pensions as this set of reforms. It's a complex cluster in some of ways, and then you have elements of it that are just matters of justice. For example, let's say an elected official commits felonies in the course of the performance of his or her duties and is then convicted of it. They won't get to keep those benefits under this new package of legislation. Yeah, it's significant, and it's a step in the right direction. Ahead are some really hard choices. A lot of the guys up at the legislature the last few weeks lobbying against any changes were firefighters in their 40s who are retired. There's not a lot of Oklahomans that retire in their 40s. That's not to be confrontational. That's a description of the process I saw every day with legislators surrounded by a cluster of firefighters or police or whatever. Those pension funds are the least touched by the changes that have been made here. And beginning to talk about them is not an insult to people who serve us. It's the beginning of a discussion about how do we pay for all this. That's still to come.